Mhm. We'll be starting up here in a couple of minutes after the top of the hour. Hmm. Stop my share for a sec. We'll be starting up here in just a minute, as soon as I get my screen share working back. One thing we recommend folks do is go ahead and open up your chat pod and your Q&A pod. We'll be using both of those during the hour we're together. And it's a little after 9, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So good morning and welcome to a day has some snow. So maybe it's a good day to talk about snow and ice strategies. I'm David Orr. I'm the director here with the New York State LTAP Center with Cornell Local Roads program. And a little snowy out in Western New York and up in the Tug today. The lake effect machine's kicking in, and that's that time of year. We will be doing some polls via Poll EV. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but we'll go ahead and get started. Just so you know, if you haven't been on one of these webinars before, down at the bottom of the screen, there's some settings for audio. We do recommend you open up your chat pod. That's not going to be enabled for you to type anything in, but that's where we put a link, for instance, to the poll everywhere, so you don't have to type it in, and to a handout which has got some resources that you might find useful, and a listing of all of the webinars that are upcoming this coming fiscal year for us. This particular session is worth one professional development hour for continuing education for engineers. Only the person who is registered gets the credit unless you've contacted us and worked with us ahead of time. It does count as a course, however, because of the interaction that's going on. If you're not from New York State, you'll need to check with the LTAP Center in your state to see if this is worth the PDH. So welcome. And again, we're going to be using pollev.com/DavidOrPE. And again, there is a link in the chat. You don't have to type that in. But we'll start with a couple of polls just to see who's here. Helps me out in terms of who I'm going to talk to and who's the audience today. So again, we got, who do you work for? Town, county, city or village, federal or state, tribal? Are you a consultant, a contractor? Or I got a couple of honest folks who work for the weekend, I see. Okay. Okay. Well, that's good. Okay, so we got some consultants, we got a few towns, a few counties, a few cities. Okay, good to know. Okay. Always like to see a variety of folks. Okay. What's your job? Are you an administrator? Are you the highway superintendent or commissioner? Are you an engineer by trade, a field crew, a supervisor of staff, board member? Or if you're none of the above, which is okay, just do me a favor and pop it into the chat, though nobody clicked on that today. I suspect we have a lot of engineers because they like those PDHs, but still useful to have everybody on board. And again, we're talking strategy today, not the general overview. And let's see where you're from. So again, this one you get to click on the map. And let me clear that. I don't know why those didn't get cleared. I cleared them all last night. You get to click again. Where are you from? So let's see where everybody's from here. Okay, we got somebody on a boat out in Long Island Sound. That's cool. They probably used to be in Lake Ontario, but don't like the, there we go. There's our Lake Ontario friend. Right in the middle of the snow bands coming up through. Okay. So, okay. Got a variety of folks. That's cool to see. Okay. Now, if you're wondering about our webinar series, this is just one of many. We have lots of webinars coming up. We've got a few more coming up in December before we take a holiday break, and then we'll have more in next year. And again, the handout has a listing of all the webinars that we'll be doing throughout 2023, 2024. And then the next September, we're actually doing a webinar on snow and ice, which is an overview one, which should be useful before we get ready for next year's winter season. Now, in terms of today, what we're going to be talking about, we're going to talk a little bit about weather, because that affects our strategy, obviously, our transportation network, our fleet, okay? We'll be spending a little bit of time talking about chemicals and abrasives, your snow and ice plan, okay? So these are the things we're going to talk about today. And again, this is more of a strategy session that we're talking about. Hopefully you're all set for this winter, and really this is just an overview, but we'll find out. So what kind of weather do we have to deal with? What type of winter weather? When you hear the word winter or snow and ice control, what are you thinking of? What are we controlling when it comes to winter weather? Let's see what people have. And again, if you can't access the poll, you're welcome to use the Q&A. You can open up the Q&A pod. Okay, you got freezing and thawing, which affects the roadway. Yeah, there's sleet, there's ice storms. Yeah, we love ice storms. Blizzards. I remember when I worked in Yates County, one of the towns, guy wanted a blizzard because he'd never been through a blizzard. And afterwards he said, well, I've been through my blizzard. I don't need to do another one. Yep, sleet, hard pack. Yeah. Okay, frost. There's lots of possible choices that we can deal with. Black ice. Ooh, that's always a fun one. Can't just snow bomb or snowmageddon or whatever term you want to use. But think about all the variety of weather that we see going on. And New York State has some of the biggest variety of any state that you could possibly imagine. And this is a map showing average snowfall rates. It's slightly off. I need to get some updated data. When I say slightly, we're talking, 5–10% kind of thing. And of course, it varies from winter to winter. Normally, the biggest lake effect areas get the most snow. And they're getting lake effect right now. Up in the Tug Hill, up the lake, end of Lake Erie, get a lot of snow coming off those lakes when the weather comes over the top of them. But of course, last winter, other than some really big storms in the beginning of the year, we didn't see a lot of snow. Most places were below average. Syracuse, for instance, which usually averages well above 100, 120 inches at the airport, got less than 80. So weather changes from year to year. And in terms of winter weather patterns, where the weather comes from affects what kind of snow, rain, ice, whatever we're going to get. If it's coming, for instance, as a clipper out of Canada, it's going to tend to be colder. And that cold air going across the Great Lakes creates that lake effect machine and really hammers the places that are in lake effect. If the winds come far enough actually from the north, we'll actually get lake effect in Ithaca off of Cayuga Lake. We've actually had bands that just hit that small area. And lake effect snow is a rather interesting critter in that you can get tons of snow, and it can be wet or dry depending upon both the temperatures and how much moisture is already in the air coming down. Normally we think of weather coming from the west to the east, and those are general storms. Surprisingly less volume of snow, but obviously can bring cold weather, especially if they're coming down with a cycle out of Canada and then coming across the country. The biggest moisture events we get are typically the storms that come out of the Gulf of Mexico and bring moisture up, especially when they hit a clipper coming from Canada. You get that mixture, or of course the famous or infamous nor'easters, which give us our biggest blizzards, where the winds actually come out of the east and they actually cycle around from the north, hence the term nor'easter. And those actually bring moisture off of the Atlantic. And that's usually where we get our biggest events that cover the whole state. And those are really hard to deal with because you can't reposition. You can't really ask your neighbor for help if you're getting buried by snow, and so are they. And those are sometimes the biggest challenges. And of course, you got to get people to stay home, except for people who are essential. So in terms of dealing with this, we have to think about your transportation network. So let's just ask, what do you maintain in the winter? When you say snow and ice control, what are you actually maintaining in the winter? Let's see what y'all say. And again, if you can't do the poll, you can throw it in the Q&A. Steps, yeah, steps outside your house. Got to be worried about that. Roads, of course, and streets, driveways. Yeah, you may maintain your own driveway. You may have sidewalks that you got to deal with, especially in an urban area or even a suburban area. You got to deal with sidewalks, or even if it's not a sidewalk, people may be walking along the roadway. You've got to deal with your equipment, and cold weather work can always be a challenge for you. Yep. Yeah, so sidewalks and roads certainly are it's you got to worry about weather affecting your other infrastructure, your bridges, your culverts, things like that. So these are the things we can be thinking about, and your own network is going to change things. And even in your own house, you may want to think about some of these kind of things. So obviously roads is what we're going to concentrate on, but you do want to think about sidewalks and trails and things like that. What do you maintain? What do you shut down for the winter? Cornell likes to put signs up for staircases that says no winter maintenance. But if they don't chain them off, people keep walking. So you may not reduce the liability that you think if you don't do a good job of blocking those things off. But what do you keep open in the winter? The sidewalk in the middle picture there is one that normally gets closed for the winter. It's a view around the big bell tower here at the university. But because of some work on the bell tower, they're going to have to maintain it this winter. So that's going to be interesting to watch. They're going to have to change their strategy on what they deal with. And of course, it comes down to we want to reduce crashes. We don't want to have people get hurt slipping on a sidewalk. And of course, we do think a little bit about the liability that goes on, but really the first and foremost things is safety. And that's the balancing act that we have to deal with, which isn't always easy. And of course, when it comes to driving on snow and ice, the distance that you go really comes down to what's on the surface. Okay. And what here is a chart that shows the stopping ratios depending on the surface conditions. So in a dry pavement, if you could stop in 100 feet or 1,000 feet or whatever, depending on your speed, when it goes to wet conditions, it goes up. Okay. So if you could stop in 100 feet on dry conditions, it might take you 170 feet. And that's just the vehicle distance, by the way. That's not the reaction time of the people. That's the vehicle distance that you're stopping. Now, one thing a lot of people don't realize is that when we're designing a roadway, we design it around that wet condition. We assume it's wet. We don't assume it's icy. So when you put up those signs that tell people to save speed, when you think about driving down the road for the curves, we're designing for wet conditions. So when it gets snowy and gets icy, things start to change. Slush and fresh sand on packed snow doubles the distance from dry and 30, 40% more then you're going to start seeing in the wet conditions. 15, 20 actually. Soft, loose snow, you're going to double the distance you need almost versus the wet design conditions and triple what you're going to have for dry. A little sand will help, but it doesn't help a lot because as soon as the traffic pushes that into the pack, you don't get the value of the sand. And snowpack, of course, really can be slippery, which is why we like to plow and keep it off. And of course, all bets are off if it's ice. If it's black ice and you can't see it, it makes it even more challenging. So the idea is we know this is going to be an issue, but what level of service can we maintain? You know what the public wants. We all know the public wants this. They want the road to be black all the time, right? That would be their optimum. We want black roads, but there's an economic cost and there's an environmental cost to try to do that. So most of us would say, a little bit of snow and ice on a low volume road is probably okay. Maybe the main roads we aim to be a little clearer, but a black road policy is not really a realistic policy. Even on the interstate, people have to slow down a little bit. So this goal might be an acceptable one in a residential area, like you see in the series of pictures we're going through, that maybe after the storm, we get it to where people can drive slowly, they're safe, they're low speed anyway. We have a different standard for different types of roads. Right after the event, though, you're going to probably have a situation like this, where even with all the care and treatment, you may have a thin layer of bonded ice, and you may want to think about changing your strategy for fixing that. And of course, during the event, you're going to have situations where it may be hard to see the roadway itself. This is where signs can actually help, especially on corners and hills and things like that. And of course, during the event, you may be out there working. Hopefully the public isn't driving if there's been a declared travels advisory, but you and I both know people will be out. Some who have to be out, people going to hospitals, schools that have been kept open, businesses that must run, farmers, dairies, things like that. But there are also a lot of people who are out there when they really shouldn't be. And this is something you actually might want to even think about with your own organization. One of the things we learned in COVID is how to work from home. Well, maybe you tell your people, there's a travelers advisory, stay home. We do that here. We don't want anybody trying to drive in when the weather says snowplows first. Okay? So let me ask, does your agency have a level of service for snow and ice in your system? Yes, in writing, yes, in my head. No, I need to develop one. No, or none of the above. And if you put, again, none of the above, please do me a favor and type in the Q&A what that means. Let's see what you got here. Okay, I'll give a few seconds for you to put your answer in. I like to see that it's in writing. That's really good. In some respects, yes, in my head is maybe the worst possible condition, because if it's in writing, you have something to work against. If you know you need to develop one, at least everybody knows it. If you don't have one, you're admitting that's true. But if it's in your head, how are you going to share that information if you're not around, if you're not available? So this is actually pretty good. Good to hear. So let's think about developing a plan, a level of service. One of the most important things to think about is you're not going to have the same level of service for every single roadway. It just isn't going to happen. In fact, it's not realistic to do that. One way to get started, not the only way, but one way to get started is to take a map of your community and look at the roads that are federal aid roads and maybe make those your higher priority. This happens to be the city of Ithaca, and you can see the green roads are the primary arterials. The purple, well, no, blue roads and the red roads are going to be your minor arterials in your collector system. You're going to have more focus on those. Everything else is a local road. And when you get to a local road, you're probably going to have a lower level of service, willing to a little bit of snow and ice bond, willing to realize you're going to get to that road last. Now, within a particular community, that may not work. You know, Cornell doesn't really have any federal aid roads within the roads that they maintain. So they're going to have to come up with a different system, but it's still the same concept. Your high priority roads are going to get maintained first, and maybe a little higher level of service. Your lower priority roads, you may have to leave. In fact, some you may close for the winter. That's where we have the seasonal limited use roadways. Okay. The dash green is against an arterial. It's just a different level of arterial that's going on. But that's the arterial that's coming into Ithaca. Now, of course, once you set a level of service on your system and you're having a good time with it, you got to figure out, can you maintain? What can you maintain? So let's talk a little bit about the fleet that you've got. Okay. So how many trucks are in your fleet? Okay. Let's see how many trucks you've got. Ooh, some of you got lots of big fleets. Okay. Some of you have a small fleet. But whatever your fleet size is, how many miles do you have to maintain to match up to that fleet? If you've got 5 vehicles and 100 miles to maintain, that's 20 miles per vehicle. Pretty easy. But if you have 1,000 miles, okay, and you've got 50 vehicles, you've still got the same maintenance headaches. Okay, so the whole point is you really need to adjust based on your fleet. And do you have any backups? What happens if you get a breakdown? Do you have any spares? Do you have neighbors that you can deal with? Okay, so these are all things you need to be thinking about when you think about your fleet. Now, when it comes to the fleet, obviously it also matters what type of trucks. I just said total trucks, but it could be 6-wheelers, it could be small 1-tons, it could be full 10-wheelers like you see here. What kind of attachments do you have? Do you have wings? Do you have variable plows in the front or just a big moldboard? Do you have live edge plows or straight carbon blades? It's going to change how you set that equipment up. So the plows are important. How you apply it matters. Do you have a simple spreader? Do you have a 0-speed spreader? Have you calibrated it lately? What kind of weather feedback do you give to the operator in the vehicle? And we'll talk about the weather feedback that you really want to give them and the challenge, of course, of getting that information. So setting up your fleet is pretty important. You've got to be thinking long-term on this too. Has anybody here ordered a truck? If you've ordered a truck in the last year, throw in the Q&A when that truck is supposed to be delivered. Throw in the Q&A when the truck is supposed to be delivered if you ordered one this year. Let's see if anybody's ordered one. Yeah, 24 months. Yeah, that's about what we're hearing. Yeah. We heard of a town that got one in 18 months, so they were lucky. So we're talking, if you're ordering a vehicle now, it's not going to be ready for the 2024-25 snow season. It's going to be the 25-26 snow season before it's available. So you're really got to be thinking long term. You've really got to come up with a management plan for all of your fleet, especially for your bigger trucks. But let's just ask the question, what other snow and ice equipment do you have beyond trucks? What other things do you have to maintain and deal with snow and ice in your community? Okay, and I'm gonna just go ahead and give you the responses. See what you guys come up with. You may have a pickup and it may have a small sander, it may have a small push broom in front of it or a small plow. Okay. You may have a loader. You may need that in a big storm. Okay. Payloaders are very common. Yeah, a shovel, a small snowblower, a large snow go. If you don't have one, maybe you've got a neighbor that you can share with. You'd be surprised what else you've got. Some people have put snow ice equipment on graders. And so it really comes down to what you've got. You may have to use these as backups. And of course, if you've got maintenance more than just trucks, maybe you've got a special attachment on your trucks. So for instance, here's a picture. This is in Canada where they were trying to come up with a spreader to spray liquids. Okay. Part of their truck fleet, but it's also a different kind of equipment than the standard spreader that we're thinking about spreading solid chemicals, even pre-wetted solid chemicals. You might have a small snowblower, you might have shovels, rakes, and implements of destruction, as Alice's Restaurant would say. But the point is, what have you got? What are your backup plans? Do you have a strategy to keep things going over the course of the entire winter? Because we know winters are tough on equipment. Do you have a place to store your chemicals? Whether they're liquids or solids, do you have a place to store them? We know that saves money in the long term, but you got to be able to get the initial short-term cost of putting it under cover. Keeping the salt dry until you want it to be wet is actually saving you money, but then you want to wet it if you can. We'll talk about wine a little bit. But what is your policy? What are your chemicals you're using? Salt, normally. What do you use for sand? You're going to have some sand in your system, some abrasives, okay? Now, when it comes to salts, we talk about mostly sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, and calcium chloride. There are other chemicals, and in our full snow and ice workshop, we talk a lot about these other chemicals, these additives that are added to it, and things like CMA and other things that are used that are not pure salts. But the reality is, all of them have a phase diagram to them. The concept is, if you put the material down, it's going to have a certain concentration, and it's got a high enough concentration, it'll lower the freezing point, and it'll cause things to start to melt. Okay? And if you get energy coming along from traffic, that can help the process. If you've ever made ice cream, that's exactly what's happening. You put the salt in, you turn the crank, it makes that bath colder than freezing, and you create ice cream. In this case, we want to create a brine so the plow can come along, or the traffic can come along and get rid of the snow and the ice. As we get dilution, as we get rain, snow, more ice, it's going to dilute the effectiveness of all of these chemicals. So you want to really get them down and get them working, which is one of the reasons why you hear us talk about getting these materials wet. So they get down, they stick, they begin to work, and then the plow can do its job. So that's where the term anti-icing comes in. And again, something you may want to think about. There are times and places you don't want to put down liquids, okay? We don't have time in our hour to talk about all of that, but you need to have a strategy in place. Anti-icing is nice, though you have to have good public relations, because I can tell you right now, you spray the road before a storm hits, and then the storm doesn't hit, it doesn't look good to the public. They don't want a white road all the time during the winter, and yet we have to balance the legal and liability issues with the environmental, the safety, and the cost. So what do you have for a policy in your community? Do you use salts? Do you use abrasives mixed with salts? Do you have treated salt that you pre-wetted? Do you use liquids? Do you have an anti-icing program? And again, if you have something else you do, just go ahead and throw that into the Q&A for us. So let's see what people have. Okay. So we got a couple of people who have abrasives mixed with salts. We have some treated salts, anti-icing, and you can pick more than one. It's okay to do that. Okay, and then in the Q&A, I see somebody has put down use salt. Okay. You're probably going to want to think about having all of these in your toolkit. Much like when you're doing pavement maintenance, you want to have different pavement maintenance techniques. You probably want to think about having other techniques. And we'll talk about why a little bit, but we can't talk about all of them in 1 hour. But again, it's something to think about. What is your plan? Now, there's a balancing act, and you have all the people you know are pushing for environmental. We need to use less salt. We actually agree we need to use less salt, but we have to balance using less salt with the safety aspects. The salt does improve safety if it's part of an overall strategy. So how do we balance those things? Understand what the chemicals can do, what the abrasives can do, and use as much as we need without using too much. That's always a tough balancing act. But let me just ask a simple question, and I'm going to ask for you to raise your hands. You're going to get ready to raise your hands. It's at the bottom of the screen. I have 2 piles of salt, uncovered piles of salt. One is 50 feet in diameter, pure salt. The other is 50 feet in diameter, and it's sand, and I've only added in one bucket of salt for every 9 buckets of sand. So just enough salt to keep it from freezing, but no more. Not the 1 to 4 that you see in a lot of places. So really very little salt added in, just enough to keep it from freezing. Rain comes along, get a 1-inch rainstorm, and I collect all the water that comes off. Okay? So first set of hands, how many of you think the pile of salt, when you take all that water, you collect it, you pull out the salt that comes from that water, you pour the water off, you get a bunch of salt left over. How many of you, raise your hand if you think the salt pile is going to have more salt running into the environment? Raise your hand. Nobody raised their hand. Okay. How many of you think the sand pile is going to have more salt? Let's see. We got 3, 5. We got about 5 of you, about a little more than a quarter. Okay. I'm going to lower everybody's hands. How many of you think they're pretty much the same? You're going to have the same amount of salt in either case. We have the American system here. We have so a total of 8 people voting out of 20. You're probably waiting for me to tell you the answer. The answer is you get a little bit more out of the pure salt pile. But if you had added more salt than 10%, you would actually get more salt to a point. Once it's saturated, you won't get more out. So they're pretty much the same. You're going to get salt runoff if you don't have a pile that's covered. So that's one issue. There's an environmental issue there. But just as important, you and I both know if you get that water on top of the pile, it'll crust over or it'll freeze up at the top. It's harder to work with it. If you can keep it dry, it's actually easier to work with it. So again, think about in your strategy, how do you cover your pile? Do you use tarps? Do you put in a building? What can you do to make it easier to work with? This should be part of your overall strategy that you're dealing with, okay? So back to our snow and ice control plan. You need to start taking your maps, developing a plan, figuring out what's going to work for your system and what's going to maintain those roads to help everybody out. Now, as part of this, you're going to have to develop your routes. And those routes could be road routes. They could be sidewalks for those who have sidewalks. It could be that the maintenance is done by the local homeowners, but that's a discussion for a longer day. But let's talk about routes a little bit. And when it comes to routes, we could have issues of length. What is your cycle time that you're going to deal with? Okay. You could have the time of day. Obviously, that makes a big difference, the time of day. Both your level of service we talked about before, but what is your staffing level? Do you get up before the school buses? Normally, yes. But what is your timing on that? So by show of hands, how many of you, let me clear everybody's hands for a sec. How many of you are able to have shifts where you can actually have folks come in at night versus only having a day shift? How many of you can have shifts? Yeah, a few of you, but most of us can't do that. So if you are only able to be there during the events, You've only got a day shift. You have to change your strategy. You have to communicate that strategy to the public. It's really important to do so. So again, things to think about. You're going to have to treat the roads differently if you're on curves and hills, because obviously you might have to increase the amount of chemical that you use if you're on a curve or a hill, because you want that road to stay a little bit cleaner than you would in a straightaway. So these are things to think about. What are your treatment amounts going to change by? How do you deal with that? If you have a T intersection at the bottom of a long hill, you're probably going to have a different plan than if you had a long straightaway with a big run out. There would not be a problem. Do you have shading areas with lots of trees? Don't cut the trees down. We like trees. There's some safety issues, but that's a different class. But again, shade can make a huge difference. The sun is a powerful tool. That's why the roads thaw from the top down after the end of winter. And we know the sun can do a lot of good work for us, but if you've got shade, you might have to change your plan. Do you have drifting? Do you have snow that goes across the roadway? You can plow it, but you'd rather stop the drifting in the first place. Are there things you can do there? There are. We'll give you a couple of examples now, and we'll talk more about this if you come to the full workshop. And of course, do you have parking? Do you have pedestrian and cyclists that you have to deal with? These are going to change your strategy. They're going to change how you manage the system. So which of the following do you have? Do you have those? You can, again, check all of these. And I put in purposely route length too long. Do you have an issue with you can't have shift work, so your time of day becomes an issue when you actually start? Do you have curves and hills? Do you have shade? Do you have drifting? Parking and pedestrian cyclists. Let's see what you guys voted for. Yeah, everybody has curves and hills. New York State is not generally too flat. There are parts of the state that are pretty flat. And yeah, if you have all of them, then you're going to have to set up a strategy to deal with all of them. Okay. Now it's interesting. None of you said your route length is too long. That's good. That's good. We know when we've talked to a lot of, especially the smaller villages and towns, that becomes an issue. Their route lengths get longer and longer. They're pushing 2, in some cases 2.5 or even 3 hours. And if they get one truck breakdown, it makes it even worse. So if you are fortunate enough to have enough trucks, think about maybe helping out your neighbor if there's an issue that comes up. Okay, so keep those things in mind. So let's figure out what your spread rate is going to be. And again, we're looking at the macro level. Think about what's going to affect the spread rate. Obviously, the weather is going to make a huge difference. The cycle time is going to make a difference because the chemicals you put down aren't going to be as effective as they get diluted, depending on the conditions. The pavement condition itself is going to change your application rate. We'll talk about these things. And then, of course, traffic. Traffic helps us. We like traffic. It can actually help us with maintenance of the roadway. You can see that. I'm looking out my window and I see a parking lot. There's snow in the parking spaces, but the actual aisles, they're pretty much cleared up by traffic. The materials that you use, of course, also are part of the equation, and we have to think about that. So let's start with weather. Okay. Now, in terms of weather, we have everything from powdered snow to ordinary snow. Okay. We got wet and heavy snow. We've got sleet, freezing rain, and rain. These are all things that are going to change how we apply it. If it's just powdery snow, you might not even have to put a chemical down. You might just be able to plow it off. Most ordinary snows, you probably want a little chemical. You don't want a bond of ice forming. That's what you're really trying to avoid, is that bond of ice so that the plow can do its work. If it's wet and heavy, you're going to want to think about, if you can, shorten up the cycle time or get out there maybe a little higher application of the rates. Okay. Now, of course, if you get sleet, freezing rain, or even rain, especially if it's getting colder and could create black ice, you're going to have to think about, do you want to continue to use liquids? Liquids can be risky on top of sleet and freezing rain. It can actually make them worse. And the same is true with rain if it's getting colder. On the other hand, having that chemical ahead of time can keep the bond from occurring, and so vehicles can break through that bond or a plow can come along. So these are all things that are going to change your rate of application that you deal with. And of course, what's the level of precipitation that you're dealing with? Is it just light powdery snow, or is it heavy? Even if it's powdery, that's going to change things because they're going to start to build up, and then traffic will push it down into slush. And of course, if there's enough traffic, it could make a bond of ice, but there's not enough traffic to push it back off. So the goal of all of this is look at the weather that's upcoming and think about what's the short-term effectiveness of your application, whether it's going to be a chemical or abrasives, And what's the dilution potential? Because that's going to change the amount of chemical that you need to apply before the vehicle can get back around the plow or whatever you're using. So these are the things you're going to have to think about when it comes to dealing with the weather. So how long is your typical plow route? I asked you earlier how many trucks you had, but what's your typical plow route? And I want it in minutes, okay? Not hours, minutes. Just put the number of minutes, typical. What's a typical plow route? Let's see what people have. 60, 90. 90 is still dominant. Okay. So again, if you have a 90-minute or 100-minute, an hour and a half, that's great. That's actually probably pretty manageable. You can deal with that. We know of lots of agencies that would be 120 or even in some cases towards 150 minutes, a really long cycle to get out there and do the work. So you can set up your route. One thing you may want to think about, if you've got a road that want a higher level of service, shortening the cycle length up for that particular route and having a slightly longer length for your other routes. And then, of course, if you've got different surface types, unpaved and paved roads, things like that, that could change things as well. But again, what's your cycle length is going to make a huge difference in terms of what you're able to do and not do. Okay? So, pavement condition. Now, I'm not talking about whether you got cracks or potholes, though that does make a difference because the chemicals can leak through. What I'm really worried about is for a given pavement, is the pavement dry? Okay. Obviously, if it's dry, you don't want to put down solid chemicals. They'll just scatter. They'll just bounce right off. So you really want wet chemicals if you're going to do anti-icing things. If it's damp, the damp can help you a little bit, but until it gets really wet, those chemicals are still going to bounce mostly. So until they're wet, you want to be thinking about pre-wetting anytime you're putting down stuff ahead of a storm. If it's slush, if it's pure slush, most of your chemicals will get through and get down to help with the debonding. But if it's really thick or starts to create ice, now you're going to have a problem in terms of can the chemicals get down into the actual pavement to create a debonding layer that the plow can take off. Because if the snow is loose, yeah, the plow can take care of it. If it's packed snow, the plow's going to get most of it, but not all of it. Even with some of the fancier new live edge and some of the fancier tools that we've got out there, packed snow starts to get harder. And of course, once you get frost or ice, it gets more challenging. And again, as I said earlier, liquids, you got to be careful of liquids when you start getting ice because there's a short term before the material starts to work, we can create a layer of liquid on top of a layer of ice and actually be slipperier. So you want to be a little careful about that. You may need to change your attack strategy. Now, a couple of other things to think about for the pavement condition. The thing we want to try to avoid is ice bonded to the pavement. In your own house, your own driveway, think about just shoveling the driveway off. If you get out there and you shovel it before you drive the car on it, you can get most of the snow off. When the car goes, you don't have any ice. But if you drive over it, you create a bond of ice. You have to have a lot more effort to take and get that off. So really what you want to try to do is keep that bond from occurring. And if there's residual snow or ice, the little bits of it, and there's not enough traffic, you're going to create ice that's going on. And what's the number one driver that starts to create that? It's not air temperature. Everybody wants to talk about air temperature. The single most important value is pavement temperature. It's the pavement temperature that creates the bonding characteristic. It's when black ice occurs, when you've got a pavement temperature that's colder than freezing. Air temperatures are above it. You get a little rain or you get something that's coming down in a liquid form. It hits that cold and it turns into ice. And if its conditions are right, it could be black ice, which you can't see until you're in the ditch. And you're like, oh, that was black ice up there. So those are never fun. Nobody wants to be in a vehicle with any kind of icing situation, but it's pavement temperature that's the driver in all of our cases that we have to deal with. Now, if you're putting down just abrasives, and a lot of agencies do have just abrasive policies, realize, especially if the pavement isn't wet or it doesn't have any kind of snow on it, 18 cars come along, the abrasives are gone. They're not doing any good whatsoever. So it's only a temporary improvement. And of course, if you're putting it on anything with thickness, any kind of snow, it's going to sink right into the snow, and it's also ineffective because it's going to push it right into the salt. I mean, it's into the snow. So really, if you have an abrasives first policy, you're going to have to be realizing it's only going to work temporarily or on certain types of roadways. You do need to have some abrasives. I'm not going to argue you don't. In fact, I'm going to ask you, when do you need abrasives? Okay, let's see what y'all come up with. And this time, hands are up. I'm going to wait and see what y'all put in and see what you come up with. Because sand has its place, but when do you need abrasives? And that's the term we use, abrasives. Most people call it sand, but we used to use cinders, though there's some chemistry and environmental issues with cinders. Okay, let's see what y'all came up with. Here we go. Ice storm. Yeah, you might need some ice storm, possibly. Again, wet surfaces, maybe. Chemicals can probably actually do that. Curves and intersection, but remember, it's only temporary. You got a lot of traffic, it may not help. Below certain temperatures, depending on your chemical that you're using, the effectiveness goes down. Okay, so certain salts don't work when it gets cold. 25 salt actually still works. It actually works. Everybody says, oh, it stops working at 25. No, it's probably closer to 20 to 15 degrees. Calcium chloride and magnesium will go a little bit colder, but remember, most of the products we use are coated with those and not pure magnesium or calcium because of economics. They'll get a little bit colder temperature, but you're going to need to have some when it gets cold. Okay, you're going to have some when it's ice. Okay, because you want some temporary improvement until the chemical can do its work. Okay, in that particular case, you actually might want to have that blend where you've got some sand with more salt. So you put the sand down for the temporary, and then you have the situation where you put the chemicals in, it does its job, you come along with a plow, and you start getting back into a better cycle. So yeah, you need to have some abrasives, okay? And of course, raise your hand if you've got gravel roads. Anybody here have a gravel road? Raise your hand if you got gravel roads. Nobody here has any gravel roads. That's the reason you didn't put that one down. If you got gravel roads, you're going to have abrasives, because if you put pure salt down on a gravel road, you just created a mosh pit. You don't want to do that. In fact, one thing to be careful of, if you do have a paved road system and you can't get to a culvert before the winter because you replaced it or you had an emergency repair, don't just keep putting salt down, because if it's a gravel surface, it'll lower the freezing point of that segment and you'll turn it into mush. You won't like yourself very much if that happens. So be aware of that fact. Gravel roads, you're definitely going to have an abrasives policy, no doubt about that. So short-term design procedure. How do we set up a strategy? How do we set up a plan for dealing with all of this? Well, determine the pavement temperature. Again, the number one thing we got to look at. Assume a dilution potential. In other words, how much liquid is coming. That's going to change your application rate. The internet, radar systems, you can buy one of these fancy tools. You can get a weather forecast from a company. But look at the dilution potential. How much liquid is coming down? And do you have a pavement bond? That's going to be the driver. You got to have the trust with your drivers. You got to communicate with them back and forth, and you got to make realistic decisions. You're going to have a little more application of chemicals if you've got a bond, or you're going to have to use special plows. Maybe you got a one live edge plow. Maybe you got to get that live edge out there on your main roadways. Okay. From all of this, you're going to come up with an application rate. One thing we recommend folks do is create a table, create a page that has a listing of what you do in certain situations. Keep it simple, don't make it too complicated, and then the driver can have it in the truck. Whoever is the crew leader managing the snow operations back at the home base has a copy, and everybody's on the same page. And of course, if you have something that happens that's outside of that, then everybody needs to talk and communicate. There's always going to be those emergencies or things that occur that you weren't prepared for, because nobody can always be prepared for everything. Now, the two emergencies we got to deal with the most, obviously, are crashes. You get a small crash, you may want to get a truck up there, hit some salt, help out the fire company or the police who are dealing with the track. And of course, if you got a major storm. What's a major storm? Well, that depends on your agency. You know, if you're talking to the folks in the Tug Hill right now, they're going, it's not a major storm. There are going to be places up in the Tug that might get over a foot of snow. On the other hand, we get a foot of snow on Long Island, that's a major storm. So you need to figure out what's a major storm in your area and how do you deal with that. The one thing I would say, if you had to pick something you could do right now that would be helpful for you, make sure you know who your neighbors are. Think about shared services. How are you going to work together? If your loader breaks down, can you borrow one to fill your trucks? Do you have equipment backup plans if something breaks? Can you help your neighbor if they have a problem? pick up the phone, create a plan. And part of that should be in your written policy. Why do we think a written policy is valuable, by the way? See what you guys have. Why is a written policy recommended? Let's see what you come up with. Yeah, consistency. Yeah. It's a communication tool to the public. Yeah. Everybody can refer to it. We all are on the same page. Yeah, legal protection, liability. It's a tremendously valuable thing from a liability standpoint. Absolutely. Okay. It's a great communication tool with the public. Okay. Everybody knows what's going on. Okay. Looking for two more if we can have here. That I hope you got the liability one. Everybody's on the same page. Communication, the public relations. It actually allows you to have a higher level of service. You may not think so at first, but if you have a plan, you can actually have a higher level of service and improve safety that you did put in there. You have a chain of command, you know what the steps are, but you have flexibility, however, and that's good plans have it, flexibility for dealing with situations on the ground, that the truck driver doesn't feel like, I just have to follow the policy. Policy should have flexibility into it, but it means you've got to think long-term, you've got to be thinking ahead. You may have to be thinking about the fact that you're not going to get those trucks for 2 years. And of course, once you have it, as you're doing your training, getting ready for the winter, you can use this as part of your training. You could do a snowplow rodeo ahead of time using the tools that you're going to be using in the winter, except for actually spreading the salt. Okay? So it's actually a good way to do things. Now, again, by show of hands, does anybody here do a snowplow rodeo anymore? We don't see them as often as we used to. Is anybody here doing a snowplow rodeo? Let's see if we have anybody doing snowplow rodeos. It's too bad. We're big fans of snowplow rodeos. Bring in a whole bunch of the agencies in an area, state, county, town, set up a course, practice. Always good to practice. Knocking over a cone is a lot better than knocking over a pedestrian, a mailbox, or a car. So training is really valuable. We really believe in that, okay? If you want a plan and you don't have one, we have one. It's in the handout. You can go and also hop on to the chat pod and you can get a link to it. But we have a winter maintenance plan that's available. You're more than welcome to start with that. Again, a written plan that you don't have to reinvent is always a good thing, and you're more than welcome to use that at any point. Okay. So we got a few more minutes together for our hour. Let me ask, which is least important in determining the chemical application rate? Type of precipitation, the cycle time, air temperature, or pavement temperature? Let's see what y'all think. Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, air temperature is surprising. Not saying air temperature isn't important, okay? But if you had to rank, if somebody could tell you the kind of precipitation that was coming, you know your cycle time, and you know your pavement temperature and your air temperature. Ranking those, I would want to know my pavement temperature, I would want to know my cycle time, and I would want to know my type of precipitation long before the air temperature. Didn't say air temperature is not important, especially important if you're dealing with black ice situations or you're dealing with ice storms. But in terms of most of the time, I really want to know that pavement temperature, especially in determining my chemical application rates. Okay. Stopping distance is shortest on which of these surface conditions? Soft loose snow, slushy snow, snowpack, ice, or none of the above. Let's see what you guys come up with. There's actually, it's a trick question. There's two right answers. Soft loose snow. Somebody said none of the above. If you say none of the above, you gotta tell me what none of the above would be. So type that in the Q&A for me if you put in none of the above. Yeah, if it was dry, I'll give you, if you were smart enough to think of it, remember that dry conditions would be the least. But of the others, yeah, it's going to be a soft, loose snow would be the least. Little bit of it starts to snowpack, that's going to go up by quite a bit. It's about 3 times as much. Ice is, of course, more. A slushy road with no bonded ice, For slow speeds, that's fine. And again, what is your policy? You may want to have a different policy on what you'd like to see during, right after, and then long term after a storm. But people have to slow down, and that's why written policy is so valuable. So a bare road policy is always recommended for high volume roads. Bare road policy. Yeah, it's a pretty easy one to give you your PDH stuff. Yeah. The problem with the bare road policy is that it's expensive. Environmentally, it actually can do some issues, and it's not possible. It is impossible to have a bare road policy 100% of the time. Think about the folks right now dealing with the lake effect bands coming off of Lake Ontario. They're getting in the range of 3 to 4 inches an hour at times. They could have a cycle time of 20 minutes and they wouldn't be able to keep the road bare. So the idea of having a black road all the time is nigh on impossible. So what you have to think about is what's a reasonable policy, okay? And remember, perfect can be the enemy of good, okay? So something to think about. And it looks like the poll may have stopped working. Well, that's okay. Polls can stop working, and we're okay with that because reality is we're just about done anyway, okay? Because these foundational webinars, they last anywhere from 50 minutes to an hour. Today's was a little shorter one. That's okay. I just wanted you to get a taste for your strategy. Hopefully you have a plan, even for your own house. You probably don't have a written policy, but hopefully you've thought a little bit about what your strategy is. In the last 3 years, I've used a total of 2 cups of salt on my driveway. Now, yes, I have a short driveway, but why? Because I've thought about all these things and I've realized, you know, if I just plow a little bit off now and then and wait for the sun, I can keep my driveway from being ice-free. The only time I have to put down a little salt is when I get the icicles off the roof and it hits on the porch. And if I don't catch it early enough, it creates ice. So that's where I got to put my cups of salt. Think about having a plan in place, both for yourself and the community you work for. And if you're dealing with these things, go for it. We do have more foundational webinars coming up in December on different subjects. But again, we also have an overview that's going to be more of a general overview of snow and ice issues beyond what we talked about today, next September. But better yet, come to the session next September on the interweb, you know, the webinar, but then come to the workshops. We have our workshop scheduled for next year, and we have snow and ice, as you can see, scattered at 6 spots around the state. Come to one of those and do the full day. A lot more detail, a lot more information. We can help you develop that one-page sheet, help you really look at your strategy, your overall plan, and making sure you're set, not only for the winter upcoming, but winters into the future. And of course, all of our workshops have a workbook that goes with them. You're more than welcome to go get those off the internet. You can go look at the sources in the handout, and you can go to our website and get all kinds of fun information. With that, we're just about done, unless somebody has a question. I'm more than willing to answer a few questions here. We got some time. Anybody have any questions that they wanted answered that we didn't answer today? Let's see what people have. Anybody have any questions for us this morning? Everybody's quiet, Amanda and Jody.
Or they're typing out a novel.
They're typing a novel. They could be typing on, but here we go. That's just great job. No, it's just an okay job. But again, think about snow and ice and realize that you're going to have a plan. And just like Eisenhower said, plans are invaluable, but plans are going to be useless in battle. Be ready to be adjusting for the winter events that are coming. Hopefully, it's a winter we can deal with, but who knows what's coming. We'll find out in March. We'll let you know how we're doing then. Everybody have yourself a good week, and we'll see you at a webinar in the future or a workshop in 2024. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.